This was the ride that rewired something in me. The kind of ride that doesn't fade with time. It waits behind your eyelids. I still see her face when I try to sleep. Washed out under the streetlight, hospital bracelet reflecting the dash, and eyes that didn't look alive or dead. Just wrong in a way the human mind isn't built to hold. Driving at night never bothered me. Bills don't care about fear, and I'd spent years in a world where fear had no place. The funeral home. I handled bodies. I confirmed deaths. I read the tiny, stubborn signals that tell you when a person has crossed that line for good. I thought that experience would make me unshakable. I was wrong. Nothing in that career prepared me for the moment I realized I wasn't alone in my own car. Not really. Just past midnight, the app pinged. Pick up near the city hospital. A strip mall I knew too well. Cracked asphalt, flickering lights, and an empty lot behind it where people waited after long shifts or long nights that didn't go the way they hoped. A typical run. Short fare, easy money. That's what I told myself while turning the wheel. Then I saw her. Older. Thin, hospital-issued coat. The sort they wrap around patients who aren't quite ready for the world outside. Paper bracelet with a barcode that looked half washed away. Hair pulled back like someone had handled her, not cared for her. She walked like every step was a negotiation. She sat like she was trying to make herself invisible. And instantly, my funeral training tightened around me like a cold hand. Her skin had that faint waxy sheen I'd seen too many times. Her fingers felt cool when I helped her in, not chilled from the cold cool, absence of warmth cool. And the car went silent. Not quiet, silent, like she swallowed the air around her. I tried to reason with myself. People leaving hospitals are exhausted. They're medicated. They move strangely. They breathe softly. They tremble. They exist. But she didn't. Not in the ways that make sense. Where to? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Home, she whispered. Just one word. But not a street, not a district, just home. She dug through her purse and handed me a piece of paper with an address written in a shaking hand. I started the ride. And with every mile, something inside the car shifted. Something I didn't have a name for. Something I used to think only the dead could carry. The first mile was nothing. I drove through the pool of sodium streetlights, the city thinned by late hours. Outside, the night smelled like rain and distant takeout. Inside, the car had the sterile tang of hospital leave. A faint chemical whiff I knew from embalming rooms and sanitized gowns, only diluted, as if she'd worn it all day, and it had soaked into the fabric of her coat. It wrapped the passenger seat like a borrowed scent. I told myself that was nothing. A hospital raises a particular odor, and people carry it home like an extra layer. But small things kept happening. Her left hand lay on her lap, palm up. At first, I thought she was asleep. Then I noticed a thin streak along the cuff of her sleeve, a red line that didn't look old. It wasn't gory. It wasn't the kind of violent stain you see in accidents. It lay there like someone had brushed at a pinprick and then forgotten. Except, over the course of 10 minutes, it seemed to brighten. Brighten is not an accurate technical term. What I mean is the color took on a fresher, almost flushed look, as if it had been dark and then blood had come to the surface. My mind supplied dead explanations. Maybe the jacket had been damp and the dye changed, maybe the light was odd, but my years handling bodies taught me to note and catalog before I dismiss. I glanced at her face. Her eyes were closed. The lashes cast a cool line on her cheeks. Her lips were parted slightly. A little condensation traced the hollow at her upper lip. That condensation, water on the skin from breath, is such a normal detail that when you see it in the wrong context, it makes the hair at the base of your skull lift. If someone is breathing, you expect warmth and a rhythm. If someone is not breathing, you expect a certain stillness, a quiet, sealed absence. This didn't match either template. It hung like a question. I felt foolish checking. It's odd. You know when you look like a worried family member, science teacher, or paramedic depending on how you ask a question. I put on my do this all the time face and asked, "You okay back there? Want me to turn on the heater?" No answer. Her chest didn't rise in any meaningful way. When I reached to feel a pulse at her wrist, I kept my hand light and quick, professional habit. The skin was cool. Not ice cold in the way of long exposed corpses or someone who has been in a freezer, but cool enough to register. I found the radial artery and pressed, careful not to linger. For a second there was nothing, and then nothing. No steady bump beneath my fingertips the way a living person offers. My training tells me to check again, at the neck. I want it to be thorough, clinical. There was no obvious rise in her throat either. Yet, at the same moment, the tuft of her sleeve where the red streak lay seemed to flex. Not a collapse, not the flaccid flop of a hand that has given up. A tightening, a small curl of a finger that would have been imperceptible to anyone without reason to look. My stomach closed. I told myself 100 times that muscles can twitch, that sedation can cause jerks, that this was all explainable. People talk about silence in a car. You don't realize how loud silence is until you are driving with someone who isn't prompting the usual traffic talk, the weather, or the small exchanges that knit strangers into a shared space. Without that layer, every noise is exposed. The whir of the heater, the distant siren, the soft slap of tires on wet pavement, they all seemed intrusive. And in that quiet, a different sound started. A small, rhythmic tapping against the upholstery. At first, I thought my tires had a stone. Then a cat perhaps on the roadside scuffing a tail. The tapping kept time with something I couldn't place. It was too regular to be random. Tap, pause, tap, pause. The kind of pattern that mimics a pulse. I looked in the dash camera because habit makes you check the tools that record your night. Text pings, weird fares, passenger ratings. The dash cam is a black box of late-night honesty. The footage showed the passenger with her head bowed, eyes closed, hand on her lap. Nothing dramatic. But when I played back the audio, the tapping was clear. It was the sound of fingertips brushing upholstery, but where exactly the motion came from, I couldn't tell. I pulled over at a light. The tapping stopped. The car hummed. The red streak on her sleeve sat there, quiet and defined, as if it had been placed. I told myself to call dispatch or 911, to do what any reasonable person would do if they suspected a medical emergency. But another instinct is professional caution. In my old job, you'd see bodies brought in that families later swore were breathing. You handle those calls with weight. There's a bureaucracy to it. Hospital paperwork, coroner forms. Drivers can be accused of carrying dead bodies if they misinterpret a situation. The fear of being blamed, of being interrogated for transporting a patient, is a real thing. For a long second, my hand hovered over the phone in the console. I tried the simplest test. I spoke directly to her. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" Her eyelids fluttered. Not the clear open of someone waking, but a small tremor, like a curtain moved by a draft. Then, slowly, her mouth shaped something without sound. It could have been a breath. It could have been nothing. I couldn't risk my judgment being swayed by hope. I remember thinking of the embalming room in that instant. The cool metal table, the folded towels, the way skin looks when blood no longer courses beneath it. There's a certain sheen that happens after the body cools. Not pallor, but a texture, as if the skin has been buffed by stillness. I told myself bluntly that was what I was seeing. My brain acted like a scientist and a witness at once. Note the observation. Don't leap to conclusions. And yet, the tapping started again, softer now, like someone tracing the seams of the seat with a fingertip. It synced with a movement I had the most trouble explaining. Her wrist, the one with the hospital bracelet, lifted a fraction, and the fingers bent, not in the weak way of someone half asleep, but in a deliberate curl, as if to find purchase. Her hand came to rest against the edge of my seat, knuckles touching the leather. No grip, no pressure, but there was contact. I felt it as a whisper against the fabric. I am not a person who panics easily. Years in a funeral setting teach you to be methodical. But methodical decisions require data. The data here were fragments that didn't fit. Small brightening on a sleeve, a rhythmic tapping that implied heartbeat but not sound, condensation at a lip, a fingertip brushing upholstery. Each item on its own was plausible. Together, they made a picture my mind wouldn't allow me to dismiss. I pulled into a parking lot illuminated by a sodium lamp. Enough. I told myself to breath like a technician and check, hard check. Pulse, breath, pupils, temperature. I did it all in a dozen movements, routine and precise. No audible breathing, no pulse at the wrist, neck quiet. The pupils reacted sluggishly to the flashlight on my phone. The skin remained cool under my hand. The red line on the cuff still sat there, and now there was a new detail, a smear on the outside of her jacket near the shoulder, as if something had been dabbed and left to set. She inhaled, a very shallow intake that should have been a nothing. It was a breath the shape of a syllable without sound. And then, impossibly, the eyelids opened in a thin slit. Her eyes met mine. There was no flash of recognition, no question, just a fixed, slightly unfocused gaze that stayed with me like metal to a magnet. They were not glassy like the dead I'd seen. They had clarity, a depth you associate with being present. But the way they didn't follow me, didn't track, blurred the boundary between awake and not. She looked at me, and for a second, something like awareness flickered. I saw, in that blink, a tiny movement. Her throat stretched, as if a cough might start. And then she moved her mouth. "Drive," she said. Not a request, not a plea. A word dropped with the weight of instruction. I don't like being told what to do by strangers. I certainly didn't like being told what to do by someone who couldn't be properly located on the scale between alive and otherwise. I felt cold with the new clarity that I had to choose. Call for help and risk the paperwork in the eyes of authority, or obey and drive, ferrying into some unknown that might haunt me. The practical side said call 911. The professional guilt said care for a human in my charge. The fear said get the hell out of there. I pulled the car back into traffic and continued. The road seemed longer. I watched the streetlights slide by, counted the intersections between our location and the address she'd handed me. The tapping resumed, but this time in rhythm with my seatbelt indicator. Tap, tap, like a heartbeat. When I glanced down, her hand was no longer on her lap. It lay against the edge of the center console, fingers splayed, nails catching light. The contact sent a strange, simple sensation through me. Not pressure, but a certainty that someone was present in a way I couldn't name. I thought of calling my friend Marco, a former colleague from the funeral home who now runs a late-night tow service and sometimes picks up small calls from ambulance crews. Marco's idea of humor is blunt, and in late-night emergencies, he has a practical way of cutting through drama. I hit his number with a shaking thumb. He answered on the second ring. "What's up?" he said, sleepy and warm with the unreality of someone who sleeps in bursts. "Do you ever see things?" I began, then stopped. The hesitation was the size of a canyon between two jobs I had done, one where you observed anomalies and wrote them down in a book, and another where you drove strangers home and occasionally counted cars in a lot. I told Marco the barest facts: hospital pickup, odd behavior, smell of antiseptic, contact with the seat. I didn't say everything. I didn't tell him how her eyes looked like they belonged to a person in a photograph at once. I didn't say I'd felt a finger press the leather. There was a pause on his end. "You sure it's not just a drunk?" Not drunk. I wanted to add, not anyone I'd ever seen in the ambulance bay. "I need you to believe me, okay? Just, if I have to stop, come by the light at 3rd. I'm 2 blocks out." "Okay," he said. The gravel in his voice told me he was already looking at his phone, thinking about his truck and his flashlight. He didn't laugh. That should have been reassuring. The car hummed along. The passenger did not speak again. I stole glances. Once, when the lights hit her profile, I saw something that made my heart go hot. A thin line of rose color that wasn't the red on the sleeve, more like a capillary that had flushed in the face of something. The color bled into her cheekbone, as if circulation had returned for a moment to a place where I did not expect it. My notebook mind, trained to observe for coroners and families, tallied possibilities: medication, vasovagal response, the simple warming effect of the heater. But warming doesn't make a cuff brighten. It doesn't make a finger extend as if to test the world. At a stoplight, she moved again. Her hand found the handle of the door and braced. She used it not to open the door, but to steady herself. The motion was subtle but coordinated. I felt something like relief and a deeper terror. If she could move voluntarily, then why had some tests suggested otherwise? Was she between states of the living, like a machine half-booted? The rational answers felt paper-thin next to the tactile certainties. I moved my hand to the back of the seat, stiffening because the seat has upholstery that sometimes reveals evidence: a dropped pill, a wrapper. My fingers brushed fabric and then met skin at the back of her neck through the collar. It was cool, but not the death-like chill. More like ice water over warm skin. I pulled my hand back like I had scalded it. The absurdity of being afraid of my own contact in my car washed through me in a wave that nearly tipped me over. "Do you need me to call someone?" I asked. My voice was steady in the way that people use to cover a crack that might become a chasm. She did something that I will remember exactly. She tightened her hand against the seat, enough to dent the leather. Not to grip, but to mark. The thumbnail left a pale crescent. That crescent looked exactly like a pressed fingertip on leather does. It was an action that implied intention. It implied presence. It implied that whatever she was doing, she wanted me to keep driving. I thought of what being a funeral director taught me. Sometimes families don't want the body at the funeral home to be disturbed. Sometimes hospitals release patients with paperwork incomplete. Sometimes people die and are transported privately. There's a bureaucracy, and you learn to navigate it with respect and caution. But there's also a moral obligation to act. If someone is ill in your car, you call for help. If someone is dead and you've transported them, you report it. The night started to feel like a ledger with missing lines. I didn't know where to write this entry. "Listen," I said finally, forcing the practical into the space. "If you're hurt, if you need a hospital, tell me. I can pull over. We can—" A soft sound came from her throat. Not a word. A breath. Then a noise like a small animal clearing its throat. Then, with more clarity than anything before, she said, "No. Drive." She used imperative language with a voice that had texture, as if a roughness sat at the edge of tone. When people are dying in a hospital, they sometimes form sentences that are almost from another life. Half memory, half instruction. It sounded like that. It sounded like someone giving directions from a map only they could see. I did as she asked. I drove. I told myself that this was safer, for her and for me. Keep moving. Get to the address. There's solace in movement. The neighborhood was quiet. Rows of small brick duplexes. A street lamp on every third house threw halos on the sidewalks. At the address, she gave me a key. It was old, a Yale type, heavy between my fingers. It opened the front door. The house smelled faintly of burning toast and the sterile ghost of hospital antiseptic. There were no lights on upstairs. The living room was neat, as if someone had cared for the same routine each night. She shuffled in with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who is careful with her balance. I followed at a professional distance. I put a hand on the small of her back to steady her as she found the hallway. Her skin was cool under my palm. She led me to a recliner, placed herself carefully, smoothed the throw over her lap. The red streak on the cuff of her jacket was visible again, as if waiting for an answer. She sat there and looked at me without asking me to go. Something in her posture suggested that the ride wasn't over for her, and it wasn't over for me. "You want anything?" I asked. It was reflex. They offer water, they need help getting up. I could have left then. I could have driven away and not taken the extra risk. But I'd been taught to close loops. The training for funerals primes you to complete rituals. Sometimes those rituals are pragmatic. Ensure the person has a contact, get a name. Sometimes they are moral. Make sure someone is not alone. She reached into her jacket, pulling out a crumpled envelope. Inside was a name and a date of birth. The handwriting was shaky. She told me where her son was, a name and a phone number. I scribbled it down. Her hand trembled as she handed me the card in a way that was as human as anyone in need of help. There was a vulnerability in that exchange I wanted to honor. I wanted to be kind. I left the porch with the address and the card. I stood on the sidewalk and texted Marco with the bare facts. At the house, strange case, eyes open, hospital bracelet, call me. I waited 2 minutes. The night pressed on me like a cold sheet. I paced, checked my messages. Marco called back. "You sure you ain't seeing things?" he asked. I heard a smile in his voice, the way old men use humor to shield worry. "I don't know," I said. "Come by." He pulled up in his tow truck 5 minutes later despite being off. He had a flashlight and an expression that said he took my calls whether he believed me or not. I told him everything again. He nodded at the right places, asked the right practical questions about the address, asked if I wanted him to check the house with me. We went to the door together. The living room was empty. The recliner sat there, indented, the throw a little ruffled. A faint perfume lingered, violets and antiseptic, the smell that had clung to her coat. The card with the name, however, lay on the coffee table where I'd left it. Marco picked it up and read the name aloud. It was a common name, and to him it was nothing but ink. He shrugged. "Maybe she went upstairs," he said. He looked at me like a man trying to combine sympathy with reason. We knocked. No answer. We called the number on the card. A voicemail said, "This number is no longer in service." The living room light flickered once and then steadied. Marco's truck idled down the street like a watchful beast. We waited another 10 minutes. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement upstairs. The indented recliner suggested she'd been there moments ago. The hospital bracelet, gone. The scent remained. I remember thinking then, everything a person leaves behind can be misread. A coat left on a chair, a bracelet fallen on the floor. People come and go. Sometimes absence is more potent than presence. I told Marco what I'd felt in the car. He listened, head tilted, the practical man hearing the absurd. He didn't laugh. He took one of those long, slow breaths that people take when they are considering the size of a problem. "You should have taken video," he said finally. It was true. In the car, I had not thought to record. We live in a strange age where our instinctual reactions are sometimes superseded by the suggestion to film everything. In a funeral home, we documented with care, but not indiscriminately. On impulse, Marco walked to the recliner and sat down. He leaned in and touched the armrest. "Feels normal," he said. He meant that the leather responded, nothing odd. He checked the buttons on the remote. He rattled through the drawers. He frowned in that way that men do when they're trying to reconcile the evening's inconsistency with everyday material life. We left. I didn't want to be there if the house was going to resolve into nothing or into something official. I wanted distance. As we climbed into our vehicles, I told Marco I was going to finish my shift. He nodded, said he'd check his log in the morning, and called it sleep. I drove away. For the next several days, the image sat in me like a splinter. I drove other fares. I picked up a college kid with a backpack, a nurse heading home from a double, a man with tears on his cheeks who didn't want to talk. The city continued its indifferent rotating. But every quiet moment refocused on the woman with the hospital bracelet and the faint, almost purposeful tapping. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself that being around death leaves a residue, like a shadow you can't quite sweep. But a man who handles the dead knows the difference between residue and a fresh brush. The distinction was making me sick to my stomach. A week later, I got a ping from a passenger just 4 blocks from the hospital. Same time, same corner. I tried to ignore the coincidence. The app insisted. My earnings needed the run. I took it. He was different from her, a younger man, shabby coat, something like fear in his eyes. He gave me a name. "You drove an old woman last week, Eleanor," he said before I could ask. He said it like a man quoting a rumor. His voice had a tremor. "My neighbor said she was seen around the block. They think—" He stopped, scanning my face, seeking approval for the story he was passing along. I hadn't told anyone, not in detail. My mouth went dry. "What did they think?" I asked, any pretense at professionalism gone. "The neighbor said she was out every night for a couple of nights, sitting on different porches. The kid across the street says he watched her at dawn, sitting on the stoop, staring at the street." His eyes flicked to me, as if trying to find a shared certainty. "Then, someone found a bracelet in the alley. Used to belong to the hospital." I felt my hands go icy. This was the beginning of a pattern, a dozen small stories knitting together. In my old job, I had seen rumors make shame out of grief. People repeated things because repetition creates reality. The young man told me these details like someone reciting lines from a play he'd never seen. He couldn't confirm more than gossip. But his voice, medium rare on fear, made the hair at my neck stand up anew. That night, restless and unable to stop thinking, I checked the dashcam footage from the ride. I know better than to rely on it as objective truth. Cameras cut away, compressed frames smear motion into ghost shapes, but it's a habit matured in the age of documentation. When in doubt, review. I set the video to slow playback. There, in the grainy footage, I saw her profile in the passenger seat. I saw the red streak on the sleeve. I saw a moment when the head bowed, and then the arm raised. The frames didn't show a clear movement of the fingers curling, but there was a blur at the edge of the seat that could not be explained away by compression alone. The audio track, cleaned up, showed the tapping. Tap, pause, tap, over and over. Nothing conclusive, but a collection of little things. I sent a clip to Marco. He watched it on his phone in a fluorescent garage light and called me back with a voice like someone had pulled him awake. "There's something," he said. "Can't explain it. But that tap? Man, that sound is real." We didn't tell police. We didn't file a report. I was too afraid of the consequences and too ashamed of my need for an explanation. If this was an error, if I'd misread a person in need of help, or if the footage would be turned against me as evidence of negligence, I feared the fallout. So I kept it to myself and to Marco, and to the slow burn of anxiety that lived under my collar like a second heartbeat. Sleep became a skill I couldn't practice. Nights stretched. I found myself avoiding the hospital where the ride had originated, changing my routes to avoid the strip mall at the corner. I quit the night shift 2 weeks later. I told the company that my schedule wasn't working for me, that morning shifts fit better with a new appointment, with family obligations I invented to make the resignation easier to explain. I stopped driving Uber full-time. The old ritual of the funeral home pulled at me too. Resignation or avoidance have different faces, but ultimately I left both jobs. I didn't feel brave anymore, only tired and watched by small, unanswerable things. For a long time, I told the story to myself with rationalizations, muscle twitches, sleep deprivation, an overactive pattern-seeking brain. But sometimes the logical explanations feel like borrowed clothes that don't fit. They hang limp and don't cover the chill. Months passed. The life you build by avoiding things is a thin one. I went back to the neighborhood once, during daylight, to see if any detail would anchor the memory. The house looked ordinary in the sun. The porch was swept, plants in tidy pots. People on stoops watered begonias. I walked the block, looking for small signs of continuity. I found the alley where the bracelet had been said to be found, and there was nothing, only city detritus and an empty bottle. Maybe the bracelet had been picked up. Maybe the neighbor had misremembered. Maybe the whole thing had never meant what I thought it did. On a whim, I drove to the cemetery 2 towns over, where I used to visit graves during the quiet hours. It was late afternoon, and the light slanted through the trees in a way that made headstones glow like old bone. I wandered up and down aisles with no particular plan, feeling foolish and guilty in equal measure. When you worked in a funeral home, you develop a map of names and dates in your head, not in a morbid way, but as a ledger of lives you have helped return to ground. I walked until a weathered stone caught my eye, a name I didn't know, a date from years back, 3 lines of epitaph. And then, tucked at the base of a different marker, a small plastic hospital bracelet, faded to the color of bone by sun and time. I picked it up. The barcode was gone, the adhesive worn. There was no name, but the feeling of recognition was immediate. You collect an object and suddenly the memory snaps into place. I thought of her bracelet when I held this one, the coolness of coupe and cheap plastic. It wasn't proof, it was an echo. People ask me now why I didn't do more, call the police, make a formal complaint, show the footage to a coroner. I ask myself the same question. I have reasons that sound reasonable: fear of consequences, the murkiness of evidence, the desire to avoid scrutiny. But there were other things too. A professional shame about letting something press against my day and not being able to name it. A personal dread that once you start asking questions about these edges, you might find more that you would rather not know. I also feared changing the story. People like to put things into boxes. Once you report something to the authorities, they apply labels: medical emergency, hoax, mistaken identity. I didn't want them to flatten what I'd seen into one of those categories. The ambiguity was, perversely, safer. It let me keep the memory as a live thing in my chest, something to be tended and not explained away. It doesn't feel noble to confess that I let fear and protocol prevent me from acting. It feels like a small moral failing. I fear that if there is a proper answer, if she was ill and needed help and I didn't give it, then that failure is as literal a wound as any. Guilt has no statute of limitations. Sometimes, on nights when the city is soft and the house is empty, I find myself listening for a tapping sound under the floorboards. Habit and nightmare mix. The mind keeps the rhythm as if trying to decode a message. I see the small crescent that her thumb left on the leather of my seat, like a scar I scrubbed for months. I see the sheen on her knuckles and the way the hospital bracelet winked at me in the sodium light. In dreams, I watch the frames of the dashcam again and again, trying to catch a fuller motion, a proof. I told Marco once that I wished people could simply accept the unknown without needing it to be monstrous. He listened, then said, "We human beings have a terrible itch for answers, but if we scratch too hard, sometimes we make the sore worse." He drives now in a truck that tows ambulances. He sees things and has learned to compartmentalize. He will sometimes call and ask me if I'm eating. We both joke like men who have seen things and want to seem brave. There are nights when I drive friends home and their small, alive movements reassure me. The pressure of a grip on my forearm when they laugh. The audible exhale of breath so normal it is almost brazen. I cling to those minor certainties like lifelines. If the world is a ledger, then some columns still balance. I never got a phone call from an official about that night. No notice came to say that a person had been located, found, or cleared. No report named her. I never saw the name on a missing persons list with a grainy photo. But months later, while nursing a coffee in a diner near the cemetery, I overheard a server mention a funeral she had attended for a woman who had died alone in her apartment. She didn't give names, just a static of details: hospital bracelet, aged recliner, family out of town. The server's voice carried the kind of empathy that people use for strangers. It was not confirmation. It was only another piece of the city's endless narrating. Sometimes memory is a mirror that doesn't like to be looked into directly. You think you are seeing a reflection, but the reflection is layered with murk and condensation. You catch glimpses of your own face in intervals, and they don't line up. That is how I remember the woman in my back seat. Some frames look like a funeral home, some like a quiet house, some like the dashboard's blinking light. All true at once, and not enough. If there is a lesson in this, it is not a tidy moral. It's that the ordinary world brims with small anomalies that stack into something inexplicable. It is that the more you know about death, the less comfortable you are with not naming what you see. And it is that sometimes responsibility is not a neat thing you can balance. It's clumsy, messy, and you live with the consequences the best you can. I stopped driving nights. I stopped walking through the city when the moon was new. I avoid the hospital on the corner where it began. I gave away my dash cam. The recliner in that house is an outline in my head. Little things stay with me. The press of a thumb on leather, the scent of antiseptic, the thin red streak on a cuff that brightened in the light. Sometimes on slow nights, I replay the footage and freeze on the blurring frame. I look for the motion, for confirmation, for the certainty that might absolve me. It never comes. I don't know what happened in my back seat. I cannot say she was alive or dead or something in between. All I can say is what I saw and felt. The hospital bracelet, the antiseptic smell, the odd brightening of a red mark, the tapping that kept time like a pulse, the motion of a hand that touched my seat. Those are my observations. They made no medical sense to me, and they still refuse to be folded into a single, clean explanation. Sometimes I imagine going back to that house and finding a small stone with her name carved into it, or a funeral notice in the paper, or a neighbor who remembers a different version of events. Other times, I picture her in my rear view as an outline against a sodium lamp, eyes half closed, instructing me to drive with a clarity that could be mistaken for command. Both images are true in my mind. I left a career where I was comfortable handling certainties for one in which uncertainty is the business. I thought the handoff would be easier than it was. It wasn't. I learned to carry that night like an ache. It taught me something ugly and necessary. Curiosity without action can calcify into guilt. The things we don't do linger and become weight. So what do I want my audience to take away? Not a belief in the supernatural, not a sensational headline. I want you to feel the shape of hesitation, the way a person trained to deal with death can freeze when the evidence doesn't fit the categories they learned. I want you to understand that the world isn't polite about its mysteries. It gives you pieces and expects you to make a whole, and sometimes the pieces are shards that never quite touch. On quiet nights, I still see a hollow at the base of my passenger seat, a pale crescent like a fingerprint. I touch the leather sometimes, expecting the memory to fizz out, but it doesn't. It is there, as real as the scar on my hand from a long-ago embalming needle that never healed cleanly. The memory sits under my skin like a stone. If this story resonated with you or sent a chill through your bones, consider subscribing for more true rides and strange nights. If you want to hear about the other odd fares I talk about when I'm trying to convince friends that the city keeps secrets, hit subscribe and stick around. I tell these stories because they're part of how I process the world I used to work in and the one I live in now. I still wonder, sometimes, what we actually leave behind when we move from one world to the next. Is it a bracelet on a curb, a red smear that brightens, a fingerprint on leather? Or is it something less tangible, a rhythm of taps in the night, an instruction given softly and a voice that isn't fully there? I can't answer, and that is the part that keeps me awake. Some nights, when the house is very still, I sit at my kitchen table and let the memory come to me without trying to arrange it into narrative. I let the tapping be a tapping, and the bracelet be a bracelet, and the eyes be eyes. The world does not always gift us closure. We live with the lack of it. If you want more stories like this, true rides, odd encounters, small things that don't add up, subscribe and watch the next video. Maybe together we'll find the courage to ask the questions that haunt us, or at least the company to keep us from feeling alone while we wait for an answer.